The wind moved through the pines like a restless ghost, carrying the bite of winter across a land few dared to enter. Deep in those endless woods stood a small cabin, its walls darkened by years of smoke and storms. Inside lived a man who had long chosen silence over company. Each morning he rose before the sun, fed the fire until it cracked alive, and stepped outside to greet a world of cold breath and creaking trees. His name was known to no one beyond the nearest trading post, and he preferred it that way. People came with questions, with noise, with promises they rarely kept. The forest gave him none of that. The forest asked for nothing but strength. He chopped his own wood, mended his own roof, hunted his own meals. The rhythm of survival was steady, almost soothing. There were no sudden voices, no arguments, no laughter echoing off the walls. Only the groan of timber in the wind and the crunch of snow under his boots. At night he sat by the fire with a mug of bitter coffee, the flames painting his face in flickering orange. He did not speak aloud. There was no one to answer. The silence had become more than a choice. It was a shield. Behind it he could keep memories buried where they could not hurt him. Years of storms had hardened his body and his mind. His hands were scarred from axes and knives. His coat smelled of pine resin and smoke. The lines on his face told stories he never bothered to share. Sometimes a raven would perch on the railing and tilt its head, black eyes bright with curiosity. He would nod back as if they understood each other, two solitary creatures bound by the quiet. In those moments, the woodsman felt less alone, but the feeling passed as quickly as the bird's shadow. Supplies were gathered once a month at a small outpost a day's journey away. He spoke little to the shopkeeper, trading pelts for flour and salt, nodding instead of offering thanks. The road there wound through frozen creeks and steep ridges, but he liked the effort. It reminded him of how far he had come from the crowded towns and broken ties he left behind. People in the outpost whispered about the man who lived beyond the last trail, but he never gave them more than a glimpse before fading back into the trees. Winter had arrived early that year. Snow buried the earth in heavy drifts, muffling every sound. Nights stretched long and dark, and the cold pressed against the cabin like a living thing. He kept busy splitting logs and checking traps, but even the forest seemed to sleep. When the wind died, the silence was so complete it felt like standing at the edge of the world. Sometimes he caught himself staring at the door, expecting nothing, yet feeling something just beyond it. He shook the thought away and fed another log to the fire. One evening, as twilight bled into night, the woodsman paused on the porch after stacking the last of the day's firewood. The air was sharp enough to sting his lungs. Overhead, stars burned like ice. He listened to the forest breathing in long, slow sighs. Somewhere far off, a lone coyote called, the sound thin and mournful. It reminded him of voices he had once known, of laughter he had not heard in years. He tightened the scarf around his neck and turned back inside, determined to keep the past locked behind the same walls that kept out the cold. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight. Shadows of antlers and tools danced across the logs. He hung his coat, sat at the rough wooden table, and ate a meal of salted meat and hard bread. Each bite echoed in the quiet. Outside, the storm began to rise again, a low moan threading through the trees. The windows rattled in their frames. He checked the latch on the door out of habit, though no one ever came this far during a snow. It was a land that swallowed the careless. As the night deepened, the woodsman settled into his chair by the fire. Flames licked the stone hearth, sending sparks into the dim room. He closed his eyes and listened to the storm's distant roar. The world beyond the forest might as well have been another lifetime. Here he needed no one. Here he belonged only to the woods, to the snow, to the endless dark. At least that was what he told himself as the wind howled and the cold pressed tighter, carrying with it a faint, unfamiliar sound, a sound he could not yet name. Snow fell in heavy, wet flakes that night, the kind that smothered sound and swallowed the moonlight. The forest disappeared behind a curtain of white, every tree wrapped in a ghostly shroud. Inside the small cabin, The woodsman sat by the fire, sharpening his knife in slow, steady strokes. Sparks leapt from the hearth each time the blade caught the light. He paused only to listen to the storm pressing against the walls, a low, endless moan that felt as if the whole world were breathing in and never letting go. Nights like this meant danger for anyone still on the trail, but to him, it was only another reminder of how far he lived from other lives. He set the knife aside, rubbed his aching hands, and leaned back in the chair as the fire snapped and hissed. Then it came, a sound so unexpected that he thought at first it was a trick of the wind. A sharp, hurried knock against the wooden door. 3 quick raps, muffled by the storm yet clear enough to freeze him where he sat. He held his breath and waited. Nothing, only the hiss of snow against the windows. He told himself it was a branch or a loose shutter. Nobody traveled this deep in winter. Nobody would survive long enough to reach his cabin through a storm like this. But before the thought could settle, the knock came again, harder this time, urgent and trembling. The woodsman rose slowly, every muscle tight with caution. His cabin had seen its share of curious travelers in the milder months, but winter brought a different kind of visitor, desperate or dangerous, sometimes both. He reached for the rifle leaning near the door, its metal cold against his calloused palm. Another knock, weaker now, barely more than a plea. The sound carried something human, something fragile. He set the rifle aside but kept it within reach, his heart thudding like a drum as he unlatched the door. A rush of icy air burst inside, scattering embers across the floor. Through the swirling snow stood a woman wrapped in a worn wool coat, her face pale and streaked with frost. Behind her huddled 3 small figures, their shapes barely visible against the night. The woman's eyes met his, wide with exhaustion and fear. "Please," she said, her voice raw from the cold. "We need help." For a moment he could not move. He had prepared himself for animals, for strangers with dark intentions, but not for this. A widow, he guessed from the absence of any other adult. Children, 3 of them, their cheeks red and raw, eyes heavy with hunger. He stepped aside without a word and motioned them in. The woman guided the children through the door, and the storm followed, swirling snow across the wooden floor until he pushed the door shut and dropped the heavy bar into place. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them, but the newcomers shivered violently, their clothes soaked through. The woodsman grabbed extra blankets from a chest and draped them over the children. They clung to each other in a small, silent knot, their breaths quick clouds in the chilly room. The woman whispered thanks and sank to her knees beside them, rubbing their hands to bring life back to their fingers. He noticed the trembling in her shoulders, the way she winced each time she moved. Hours in the storm had left their mark. He moved to the hearth and stirred the fire until it roared. The cabin filled with the scent of burning pine. "Sit closer," he said, his voice rough from days of disuse. The woman obeyed, gathering the children near the blaze. Their faces glowed orange against the dark room, eyes wide as they watched the flames climb higher. The youngest, a little boy no more than 4, reached a timid hand toward the warmth. The woodsman tossed another log onto the fire and fetched the kettle, filling it with snow to melt for tea. The woman watched him carefully, her eyes sharp despite her exhaustion. She introduced herself in a quiet voice, Anna. Her children were Clara, 10, Sam, 7, and little Thomas. Their wagon had broken a mile or 2 down the trail when the storm rolled in. They had been walking for hours, hoping to find shelter before the cold claimed them. "We saw the light," she said, glancing toward the shuttered window. "I didn't know if anyone lived out here." He gave a short nod. Words came hard to him, but he managed a few. "Lucky you found it." He set the kettle on the fire and reached for a loaf of bread, slicing thick pieces and laying them on a plate. The children's eyes followed every movement, hunger bright in their faces. He handed the plate to Anna, who passed the bread carefully among them before taking a piece herself. They ate in silence at first, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the storm clawing at the roof. As they warmed, the children began to speak in soft, hesitant voices. Clara thanked him for the blankets. Sam asked if he had shot the deer skull hanging above the door. Little Thomas pointed at the iron kettle and giggled when the steam hissed like a snake. Their small voices filled the cabin in a way it had not known for years. The woodsman found himself listening more than he intended, answering questions with short grunts that soon grew into full sentences. Something in their presence chipped at the wall of quiet he had built around himself. Anna removed her coat and revealed a simple dress patched at the elbows. Her hair, damp from melting snow, clung to her temples. She explained that they had been traveling west in search of a new start after losing their farm to drought and debt. Their supplies were nearly gone when the wagon wheel snapped. She had hoped to reach a settlement before nightfall, but misjudged the storm's speed. "We wouldn't have made it another hour," she admitted, her voice breaking for the first time. She quickly looked away, blinking back tears. The woodsman studied her face, the determined set of her jaw despite the fatigue. He recognized the look of someone who had fought too long to surrender. It stirred a memory of battles he had fought himself, of losses he rarely allowed to surface. Without thinking, he poured hot water into tin cups and slid them across the table. "You'll stay here tonight," he said, more command than offer. "Storm's not letting up." Anna opened her mouth to protest, then closed it with a small nod. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying a weight he could feel. She wrapped her hands around the cup and let the steam rise against her face. The children sipped carefully, their cheeks flushed from the heat. Hours passed as the storm raged outside. The woodsman found extra bedding and spread it near the hearth. The children settled quickly, exhaustion overtaking fear. Anna remained awake, her eyes on the fire, shoulders relaxing only when she saw her children safely asleep. He sat across from her, sharpening his knife out of habit, though he barely looked at the blade. They exchanged few words, yet an understanding grew in the silence, a shared relief, a fragile trust. Every creak of the cabin reminded him that he was no longer alone. The sound of another person breathing, the faint rustle of blankets, even the soft sighs of sleeping children, all of it felt strange and strangely welcome. He studied the woman across the firelight, noting the lines of hardship etched into her face, the steady resolve behind her tired eyes. Something in her presence unsettled him, not in fear but in the way it made the cabin feel warmer than the fire alone could provide. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy. Snow piled high against the door, sealing them in. The woodsman rose once more to check the latch, then returned to his chair, the rifle still leaning close by. He had lived years without expecting a single visitor. Now, in one night, 4 strangers shared his shelter, filling the space with quiet life. He watched the flames dance and felt an unfamiliar pull in his chest, a stirring he could neither name nor push away, as the storm howled on beyond the wooden walls. The morning came slow and gray, a pale light leaking through the frost-rimmed window. Snow lay heavy against the cabin walls, softening every sound until the world seemed wrapped in cotton. The woodsman woke to the faint crackle of the dying fire and the gentle breathing of the strangers who now shared his shelter. For a long moment he remained still, listening. Instead of the usual hollow silence, the room carried a quiet rhythm, the small sighs of children sleeping, the rustle of blankets, the low murmur of another heart beating somewhere near. It felt strange, almost fragile, like stepping onto a frozen pond and wondering if the ice would hold. He rose carefully so as not to wake them. His boots met the floor with a muffled thud. The kettle on the hearth had cooled to a thin crust of ice, so he set it back on the coals and fed the fire until it flared alive. Sparks jumped and shadows retreated to the corners. The smell of smoke filled the air, sharp and familiar, but mixed now with the faint scent of wool and human warmth. He caught himself glancing toward the bedding where the widow and her children slept, their faces softened by the glow. Little Thomas clutched a blanket near his chin, lips parted in a dream. Sam lay curled like a pup, one hand stretched toward his sister. Anna, the mother, rested on her side, her dark hair fanned across the pillow in a way that made her look younger despite the strain etched into her features. When the fire popped, Anna stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, wary until they found his figure near the hearth. Relief softened her gaze. She whispered a quiet good morning and eased herself upright. The children remained asleep, their breathing deep and even. The woodsman handed her a tin cup of hot water, the closest thing to tea he could offer before the snow let up enough for hunting or gathering. She accepted it with both hands, steam curling around her fingers. "Thank you," she said, her voice still rough from the night. "I don't know what we would have done if you hadn't opened the door." He gave a short nod, uncomfortable with praise. "Storm was too strong. You'd never have made it back to the road." His words were plain, but the truth behind them weighed heavy. He knew the forest would have swallowed them whole if not for the small circle of light his cabin cast into the dark. Anna sipped carefully and studied him over the rim of the cup. "You live here alone?" she asked. "Yes. For how long?" "Long enough." He kept his eyes on the fire, not ready to peel back the years of silence that hid his reasons. She seemed to sense the boundary and did not press. Instead, she pulled the blankets higher around her children and watched the flames dance. The quiet between them was not the empty kind he once embraced. It carried a pulse of understanding, a recognition of two lives that had each chosen a hard path. As the morning brightened, the children began to stir. Clara blinked first, rubbing her eyes before offering a shy smile. Sam sat up with a start, his hair sticking out in every direction. Little Thomas stretched his small arms and yawned wide enough to make Anna laugh softly. The sound surprised the woodsman. It had been years since laughter drifted through these walls. He found himself smiling before he could stop it. Breakfast was simple, dry bread warmed by the fire and strips of venison jerky from his stores. The children ate eagerly, crumbs scattering across the rough wooden table. Clara thanked him with the polite tone of a girl taught to mind her manners even in hardship. Sam peppered him with questions about the traps and tools hanging on the walls. Thomas held his piece of bread like a treasure, savoring each bite. Their voices filled the cabin with a gentle clamor, a music he hadn't realized he missed. After the meal, the woodsman pulled on his heavy coat and opened the door to check the storm's aftermath. A wall of snow greeted him, waist-high and glittering under a weak sun. The trees bowed beneath their burden, branches snapping in the distance like distant gunfire. He stepped outside and inhaled the crisp air, the cold slicing clean through his lungs. Behind him came the soft sound of boots crunching snow. Anna stood at the threshold, coat drawn tight, eyes scanning the endless white. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "It's dangerous," he replied. "Snow this deep can hide the trail for days." She nodded, her gaze lingering on the forest edge where the world blurred into blue shadow. "Our wagon is still out there," she murmured. "I left everything we owned. I don't even know if the horses—" "We'll find it," he said, cutting off the worry before it gathered. "When the wind dies, I'll help you dig it out." Her shoulders eased, though the fear in her eyes remained. They stood together in the cold, two figures dwarfed by the wild, until the children's laughter drifted from inside and pulled them back to the warmth. The day passed in quiet work. The woodsman showed Clara and Sam how to stack firewood and pack snow around the base of the cabin to keep the drafts out. They followed his instructions with eager determination, their small faces bright with purpose. Little Thomas toddled behind them, dragging a stick and leaving crooked trails across the packed path. Anna helped mend a torn blanket using a needle from his kit, her fingers quick despite the chill. Each task wove them deeper into the life of the cabin, as if they had always belonged. While they worked, Anna shared fragments of her story. Their farm had withered under years of drought. Her husband had passed the previous spring, leaving debts she could not pay and land she could not keep. She sold what little remained and set out west, hoping for a settlement that might welcome a widow with children. The storm caught them before they reached the next town. Her voice trembled when she spoke of the wagon breaking, the horses panicking, the miles of empty forest. She glanced toward her children, lowering her tone. "I didn't know if we would make it." The woodsman listened without interruption. He recognized the quiet desperation behind her words, the stubborn will to keep moving even when the world offered nothing but loss. Though he said little, something in his steady presence seemed to give her strength. When she finished, he only said, "You kept them alive. That's what matters." The simple truth brought a faint smile to her tired face. As the sun dipped behind the trees, a blue twilight settled over the forest. The woodsman led the children in bringing in the last of the firewood, while Anna prepared what remained of the venison for supper. The smell of cooking meat filled the cabin, richer than anything they had eaten in weeks. Sam and Clara crowded near the hearth to watch, their eyes reflecting the glow. Thomas clapped his small hands in delight, his earlier shyness forgotten. Anna caught the woodsman's eye across the room and gave a small nod of gratitude. He returned it with a brief, almost awkward smile. Night fell quickly. The wind outside softened to a low murmur, carrying the promise of another storm or perhaps the calm before one. Inside, the fire roared, casting golden light on faces that only yesterday were strangers. The children played a simple game with wooden blocks the woodsman carved during long winters. Clara built careful towers while Sam tried to topple them with flicks of his finger, each collapse followed by giggles that echoed off the log walls. Thomas crawled from lap to lap, content to be wherever warmth and laughter lived. Anna watched them with a look that mixed relief and wonder. The woodsman noticed the way her shoulders finally relaxed, the way her eyes softened when she caught him watching. Something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared struggle, of unexpected refuge. He felt it like a spark in the cold, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Later, after the children drifted to sleep, Anna remained awake near the hearth. The woodsman sat across from her, sharpening his knife in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound of steel on stone filled the space between them. She broke the silence first. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done," she said. "You saved us." He shook his head. "Storm isn't over. You stay until it's safe. That's all. But you didn't have to open the door," she insisted. "Most people wouldn't." He paused, considering. "Maybe I needed to," he admitted, surprising himself with the words. They hung in the air, soft and uncertain, like a confession neither of them expected. Anna lowered her gaze to the fire. "Whatever the reason, I'm grateful." Her voice carried a quiet conviction, the kind born from hardship and survival. They sat together in the warm glow, the storm outside fading to a gentle whisper. For the first time in years, the woodsman felt the cabin alive with more than the echo of his own thoughts. He listened to the slow breathing of the sleeping children, to the soft crackle of the fire, and to the faint heartbeat of possibility that pulsed beneath the silence. Something had shifted the moment he opened the door, though neither of them yet knew how deeply that knock would change the path ahead. The next day began with a sky the color of cold iron. Thin shafts of light filtered through the trees, making the snow glitter like scattered glass. The storm had quieted during the night, leaving behind drifts so deep they swallowed fence posts and buried fallen branches. The woodsman woke first, as he always did, but now there were quiet sounds that belonged to more than one life. He heard the soft breathing of the children, the creak of the wooden floor as Anna shifted in her sleep, the muffled crack of ice sliding from the roof. The cabin felt different, as though it had grown warmer from the weight of so many hearts beating inside. He stoked the fire and pulled on his coat before stepping outside. The cold bit at his face like a blade, but the air was still and crisp. He pushed open the door to a world remade overnight, trees heavy with snow, a frozen creek flashing silver under the pale sun. Behind him came the soft scrape of boots. Clara appeared in the doorway, her cheeks pink from sleep. "It's beautiful," she whispered, eyes wide. He handed her a pair of mittens that once belonged to no one but now seemed to have been waiting for her. She grinned and tugged them on, following him into the sparkling morning. Sam soon joined, bounding through the snow with a stick he had claimed as a sword. Thomas toddled after, leaving a crooked trail of tiny footprints. Anna emerged last, wrapping a scarf tightly around her neck. Her eyes swept the forest with a mixture of awe and caution. "Is it safe to go far?" she asked. The woodsman nodded toward the clearing. As long as we stay near the cabin. The snow hides holes. Best to move slow." Together they began the work of survival. The woodsman showed Sam how to check the traps he had set before the storm. They trudged through knee-deep drifts, each step a small victory. Sam's questions tumbled out in a rush. How to set the trigger, how to tell if an animal had passed, how to skin a rabbit without wasting the hide. The woodsman answered patiently, surprised by his own willingness to teach. Clara helped gather fallen branches for kindling, her small hands brushing snow from each piece before adding it to the sled. Thomas followed with delighted squeals whenever a branch snapped underfoot. Anna walked beside them, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes meeting the woodsman's whenever the children laughed. Each glance carried a quiet gratitude he felt deep in his chest. By midday, they returned with arms full of wood and a single rabbit caught in one of the snares. The children crowded around as the woodsman prepared it, their curiosity stronger than their squeamishness. He showed Clara how to clean the pelt and explained how nothing in the forest should be wasted. Anna watched from the table, her hands busy mending a tear in Sam's coat. "You've lived out here a long time," she said softly when the children were distracted. He gave a small shrug, "Long enough to learn what matters." She studied him for a moment, as if trying to read the history etched into his weathered face, but asked no more. The afternoon passed in a rhythm of shared tasks. Clara helped grind dried corn into meal while Sam fetched water from the creek, careful to avoid the weak ice. Thomas carried small pieces of wood from the pile to the hearth, proud of every trip. Anna worked beside the woodsman to prepare the rabbit, their hands moving in silent cooperation. Each chore wove them tighter into a fragile circle of trust. The cabin, once a place of echoing solitude, now hummed with quiet industry and the soft sounds of a family learning to survive together. As the day faded, the sky flushed with streaks of rose and gold. The woodsman led Anna to the ridge behind the cabin, where the trees opened to a wide view of the valley below. From there the world stretched endless and untouched, a sea of snow rolling toward distant mountains. Anna stood in awe, her breath catching in the cold air. "It feels like the edge of the earth," she said. He nodded, eyes scanning the horizon. "Out here you learn how small you are, and how strong you have to be." They stood side by side in the fading light, listening to the faint crack of ice and the distant call of a raven. For a brief moment the woodsman felt the years of solitude slip away like melting frost. He glanced at Anna, noticing the way the sunset caught in her hair, the steadiness in her eyes despite all she had endured. A warmth stirred in him that had nothing to do with the layers of wool or the fading sun. He turned away before she could see it, unsure of what to do with the feeling. Back inside, the children prepared for the evening with a kind of practiced excitement. Clara arranged the wooden blocks into a fortress while Sam fashioned a tiny flag from a scrap of cloth. Thomas clapped and laughed, his cheeks flushed from the cold. Anna served bowls of steaming rabbit stew, the rich scent filling every corner of the cabin. They ate around the table, sharing stories of the journey west and the wildlife that roamed the forest. Sam begged for tales of bears and wolves. Clara wanted to know how the woodsman learned to live alone. He answered with careful fragments, enough to satisfy their curiosity without opening doors he preferred to keep closed. After supper, Clara and Sam begged to hear a story before bed. Anna began softly, telling a tale from her own childhood about a fox who outsmarted a hunter. Her voice carried a gentle rhythm that soothed the room. The woodsman listened from his chair by the fire, watching the children lean against their mother, eyes heavy with sleep. When the story ended, Clara rested her head on Anna's shoulder and whispered, "I like it here." Sam nodded, already half asleep. Thomas curled against the blankets with a contented sigh. Anna brushed their hair back with a tender hand, her eyes meeting the woodsman's across the fire. In that quiet look, he read something that went beyond gratitude, something that hinted at the possibility of belonging. When the children finally drifted off, the woodsman and Anna remained near the hearth, the fire painting their faces in soft gold. Outside, the night deepened to a velvet black, stars scattered like frozen sparks. The cabin settled around them with the creak of old timber. Anna spoke first, her voice low to avoid waking the children. "They haven't laughed like this in months," she said. "Not since everything." She hesitated, then added, "You've given them more than shelter. You've given them a piece of safety I thought we'd lost." He stared into the flames, the weight of her words settling over him like fresh snow. "It's only for a while," he said quietly, "until the trail clears." Anna studied his profile, the strong lines softened by firelight. "Maybe," she said, "but a while can mean a lot." Her words lingered in the warm air, carrying a depth that made his chest tighten. The woodsman shifted, suddenly aware of how small the cabin felt with her sitting so near. He thought of the years he had spent building walls around his heart as carefully as he built the logs that held the roof above them. Yet here she was, sitting across from him with her children asleep only feet away, and those walls felt thinner than he had ever imagined. He cleared his throat, searching for safer ground. "You should all get some rest. Tomorrow we'll try to find the wagon." Anna nodded but did not move. For a long moment they sat in companionable silence, the fire snapping softly between them. Outside, the forest kept its secrets. Inside, a quiet bond grew stronger, rooted in shared work and the simple miracle of survival. The woodsman felt it settle around him like a second skin, unfamiliar, yet warm. The next morning broke with a pale, hesitant light, as though the sun itself wasn't sure if it wanted to climb over the frozen hills. A thin mist hovered between the trees, curling around trunks like breath from some sleeping giant. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low, but the air was still warm from bodies sleeping close together. The woodsman opened his eyes to the sound of soft voices. Clara and Sam whispered near the hearth, trying to keep Thomas from waking. Anna sat with her back against the wall, her face turned toward the small window where the first streaks of dawn crept through the frost. For a moment he simply watched, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle into the room. Their presence no longer felt like intrusion. It felt inevitable, as if they had always been meant to fill the silence he once guarded. He rose quietly, pulling on his boots, and stepped outside. The snow had hardened overnight, a crust of ice glittering under the weak light. The air carried the sharp tang of pine and the faint promise of another storm waiting beyond the mountains. He scanned the tree line, listening to the distant snap of branches under their own weight. Somewhere far off a bird called, thin and lonely. The sound reminded him that the trail to town would remain treacherous for days, maybe weeks. The thought brought both relief and unease. Relief because their stay would continue. Unease because every passing day deepened a connection he wasn't sure he had the right to keep. Anna joined him soon after, wrapping her coat tight against the cold. "It's clearer today," she said, her breath making small clouds in the morning air. "Maybe we could try to reach the wagon." He nodded, already considering the safest path. "We'll go after breakfast. The children can stay here. It's too deep for them." She looked out at the endless white and bit her lip. "I don't want to leave them." "They'll be safe," he said. "I'll lock the door. We won't be gone long." Her eyes met his, searching for a reason to doubt but found none. Finally she nodded, trusting him in a way that felt heavier than any promise he had ever made. After a quick meal of cornmeal and dried berries, they set out with a sled and shovels. The woodsman broke the trail, his strong legs carving a path through snow that reached to his knees. Anna followed close behind, her breath sharp and steady. The forest was silent except for the scrape of sled runners and the soft crunch of their boots. Sunlight slanted through the trees, turning the mist to silver ribbons. Each step carried them deeper into the wilderness, and yet he felt no fear. Her presence beside him made the forest seem less like an endless threat and more like a vast, shared world. They reached the wagon after nearly an hour. It sat half buried beneath a snowdrift, the canvas torn and stiff with ice. One of the horses lay frozen nearby, a silent shadow against the white. Anna stopped, covering her mouth with a gloved hand. The woodsman rested a hand on her shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort that neither of them questioned. Together, they began the slow work of digging through the packed snow, uncovering what supplies remained. A chest of blankets, a few sacks of flour, a small tin of coffee, all precious in the heart of winter. Each item they salvaged carried the weight of survival. While they worked, Anna spoke of her journey. She told him how she had promised her late husband she would keep the children safe, how every mile west had felt like a test she could not fail. Her voice trembled only once when she described the night the wagon wheels snapped, leaving them stranded in the growing storm. He listened without interruption, his shovel cutting steady lines through the snow. When she fell silent, he said only, "You kept them alive. That's what matters." The words were simple, but they brought a faint smile to her tired face. By the time they loaded the last bundle onto the sled, the sun had climbed higher, casting long blue shadows across the clearing. The woodsman studied the trail back to the cabin. It would be a hard pull, but manageable. Anna stood beside him, breathing hard from the effort. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You don't have to," he replied, tightening the rope on the sled. "We survive. That's thanks enough." The journey back was slower, the weight of the supplies dragging against the snow. Anna insisted on helping pull, her determination matching his strength. They spoke little, but their silence felt companionable rather than awkward. Each shared glance carried more than words could hold, a recognition of trust, of respect earned through hardship. When the cabin finally came into view, Clara and Sam burst through the door, their faces bright with relief. Thomas followed with a delighted squeal, nearly tumbling into the snow. Anna dropped to her knees to embrace them, her eyes shining with both joy and exhaustion. The woodsman stood back for a moment, watching the reunion with a strange ache in his chest. He had once believed his life was complete in its solitude, but the sight of these children clinging to their mother stirred something deep and undeniable. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity. The children helped carry the recovered supplies inside while Anna organized what food remained. The woodsman repaired the sled and checked the traps, his movements purposeful but his mind restless. Each time he glanced at the family bustling around his cabin, a question pressed harder against the walls he had built inside himself. What would happen when the weather cleared? They would continue west, chasing a future beyond the mountains. He would remain behind, alone once more. The thought settled like a stone in his chest. That evening, after supper, Anna sat with him near the fire while the children played quietly with the wooden blocks. The flames painted her face in shades of gold and copper, bringing out the strength in her eyes. She watched the children for a long time before speaking. "When the trail opens," she said softly, "we'll have to move on. There's a town a few days west. They might need workers. I can sew, and Clara can help with the younger boys." The woodsman stared into the fire, the crack of burning pine loud in the sudden quiet. "It's a hard road," he said, "and the next town isn't kind to strangers." "I know," she replied, "but we can't stay here forever. You've already done more than anyone else would have." He wanted to argue, to tell her that the forest could provide what no town could, that the cabin, once a fortress of solitude, had become something else entirely. But the words caught in his throat. Instead he asked, "Do you want to leave?" Anna hesitated, her hands tightening around the mug she held. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "I only know I have to keep them safe." The woodsman studied her profile, the way the firelight softened the worry lines around her eyes. He thought of the children's laughter echoing through the cabin, of the quiet conversations shared over morning coffee, of the unexpected warmth that had taken root in his heart. The idea of watching them walk away felt like facing a winter without fire. When the children finally drifted to sleep, Anna remained by the hearth, her gaze lost in the flames. The woodsman set aside his carving knife and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "You could stay," he said, the words rough but steady. "At least through the winter. There's enough room, enough food if we work together." Anna looked up, surprise flickering across her face. For a heartbeat neither of them spoke. Then she said, "And after the winter," he hesitated, the answer both simple and impossibly complex. "We'll see," he said. one season at a time. Her eyes searched his, weighing the unspoken promise behind the words. Slowly, a small, weary smile curved her lips. One season, she echoed, almost like a question. He nodded, feeling the tension ease from his shoulders. Outside, the wind rose again, rattling the shutters as if to remind them that the forest would decide their future more than any plan could. Inside, the fire burned steady, casting long shadows on the walls. Anna reached for a fallen log and placed it on the flames, her movements sure and graceful. The woodsman watched her hands, the steady confidence in each motion, and felt something settle inside him. A quiet certainty that whatever path lay ahead, this night marked a choice he had already made. Later, as the storm gathered strength beyond the walls, he checked the locks and shuttered the windows. Anna tucked the children under thick blankets, her voice a soft murmur that blended with the crackle of the fire. When she turned back, the woodsman stood by the door, snow-dusted coat still hanging from his shoulders. Their eyes met across the small room. No words passed, but a silent understanding filled the space between them. The decision had been made, not in speeches or plans, but in the steady rhythm of days shared and trust quietly built. The cabin, once a refuge for a single man, now held the fragile beginnings of something neither of them had dared to imagine. Winter stretched on like an endless breath, each day blending into the next with the slow rhythm of snow and fire. The forest changed with the weeks, the heavy drifts settling into deep blue shadows while icicles thickened like glass teeth along the cabin roof. Inside, life took on a new pattern. The woodsman no longer woke to an empty room. Instead, he rose each morning to the soft murmur of voices, the rustle of blankets, the faint giggle of a child trying to stay quiet and failing. The cabin that had once been a silent fortress now pulsed with warmth and small surprises. Clara was usually the first to stir. She liked to help start the fire, her quick fingers stacking kindling with careful precision. Sam followed soon after, eager to fetch water or carry wood, his energy spilling across the room like sunlight. Little Thomas would roll out last, hair sticking up in every direction, his sleepy grin melting whatever chill lingered from the night. Anna moved among them with a quiet grace, her voice soft but firm as she guided their small tasks. The woodsman found himself watching her more than he intended, noticing the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear or smiled, when one of the children surprised her with a hug. These small moments settled deep inside him, reshaping the cabin into something more than shelter. They worked together to keep the winter at bay. The woodsman taught Sam how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to spot the faint marks of a fox or rabbit along the frozen creek. Clara learned to mend nets and set small traps, her steady hands showing a patience beyond her years. Anna helped with everything, from splitting logs to curing hides, her determination steady even when the wind bit hard and the cold burned their skin. What had once been chores for survival became rituals of connection. Each task carried laughter, quiet conversations, or the simple comfort of standing shoulder to shoulder against the cold. The forest no longer felt like an enemy. Instead of a lonely expanse, it became a playground for the children and a shared challenge for the adults. They ventured out on calm days to gather pine cones for kindling, or to follow the tracks of deer across frozen fields. Sometimes they stopped to listen to the silence, a deep hush broken only by the distant creak of trees and the faint whisper of falling snow. The woodsman would glance at Anna during these pauses, catching her eyes as she took in the beauty around them. There was a steadiness in her gaze that felt both grounding and impossible to look away from. Evenings brought a different kind of warmth. After supper, they gathered near the fire, the children sprawled on the rug, while Anna sewed or read from an old book she had saved from the wagon. Clara loved to hear stories about the stars, and Sam begged for tales of the woodsman's life before the forest, though he rarely gave more than fragments. Thomas, too young for questions, simply curled against his mother and watched the flames dance. The woodsman listened to their voices and felt something he had not known he was missing, the sound of belonging. It was not loud or grand. It was a quiet rhythm, steady and sure, like the heartbeat of a home. Days passed and the snow began to soften under the first hints of spring. Sunlight lingered a little longer in the evenings, melting thin sheets of ice from the cabin windows. Birds returned to the trees, their calls sharp against the thawing silence. With each change came the reminder that the trail would soon open, and the question that had hung between the woodsman and Anna grew heavier. The children spoke of the journey west with curiosity, wondering what towns might lie beyond the mountains. Anna mentioned it less and less, her eyes lingering on the cabin as if memorizing every detail. One afternoon, while the children played outside, Anna joined the woodsman as he repaired a section of the fence near the creek. The air carried the scent of wet earth, a sign that winter was loosening its grip. She held a post steady while he hammered it into place, their movements synchronized by days of shared labor. After a long silence, she said, "The snow will clear soon." Her voice was calm, but there was a weight beneath the words. He kept his eyes on the post. "It will. The children ask when we'll leave," she continued. "I tell them we'll decide when the time comes." He paused, resting the hammer against the wood. "And what do you want?" Anna looked toward the cabin where faint laughter floated through the trees. "I want them safe," she said softly. "I want them to have a place where they can grow without fear." The woodsman turned to face her, the cool breeze lifting strands of her hair. "They have that here," he said, the words more certain than he expected. Her eyes met his, steady and searching. "And you, would you have us stay?" The question landed like an arrow, sharp and direct. He had avoided it for weeks, burying his feelings beneath the routine of survival. Now there was no room for silence. "Yes," he said simply, "I would." Anna studied him, her expression unreadable at first. Then a faint smile touched her lips, small but full of meaning. "I think," she said, "that they already feel at home." They finished the fence without another word, the decision unspoken but understood. When they returned to the cabin, the children ran to greet them, their cheeks flushed from play. Clara proudly presented a small bouquet of early wildflowers she had found beneath a patch of melting snow. Anna accepted them with a quiet laugh, her eyes shining with something the woodsman recognized as more than gratitude. That night, the cabin glowed with a warmth that came from more than fire. The children played until sleep pulled them under, leaving Anna and the woodsman by the hearth. Outside, the moon rose over the forest, casting silver light across the softening snow. Inside, the air held the faint scent of pine and wood smoke, the kind of smell that stays in memory long after it fades from the air. Anna sat with her sewing in her lap, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "When I left the farm," she said quietly, "I thought we'd spend years wandering before we found a place to belong. I didn't expect this." The woodsman leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Neither did I." For a long time they sat in silence, the kind that no longer felt heavy but instead wrapped around them like a soft blanket. He could hear the slow breathing of the children in the next room, the crackle of the fire, the faint sigh of the wind against the walls. Every sound carried the promise of a life no longer defined by loneliness. As the weeks turned to months, the forest transformed. Snow gave way to damp earth and budding trees. Streams swelled with melted ice, and birdsong filled the air each morning. The woodsman watched the children explore the changing landscape, their laughter echoing through the valley like music. Clara gathered wildflowers for the table. Sam learned to carve small figures from spare wood. Thomas toddled after them with fearless delight, his small boots sinking into the soft ground. Anna moved through it all with quiet strength, her presence as steady as the hills. The cabin itself changed in small but meaningful ways. Bright curtains now framed the windows. A row of tiny shoes lined the door. The table bore scratches from games played late into the night. Each mark told a story of life unfolding, of a house becoming a home. The woodsman found himself smiling more often, speaking more freely, laughing at jokes that once would have fallen flat in the emptiness. The solitude that once defined him had softened into something richer, something shared. One evening, As the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold, he stood on the porch with Anna, watching the children chase fireflies in the growing dusk. The forest hummed with the sound of spring, frogs in the marsh, the rustle of new leaves, the distant rush of a swollen creek. Anna leaned against the railing, her eyes following the children's darting lights. "They've changed," she said. "They're stronger, happier. So have you," he replied, his voice quiet but sure. She turned to look at him, her face glowing in the fading light. "And you," he met her gaze without hesitation. "More than I thought possible." Anna reached for his hand, her fingers warm against his rough skin. They stood together in the soft evening, watching the children laugh and run beneath the rising stars. The woodsman felt the forest around them, vast, wild, and unending. But for the first time in years, he did not feel small within it. Instead, he felt anchored, rooted by the bonds that had grown in the heart of winter and blossomed with the spring. The life he once guarded so fiercely had opened like the woods around them, revealing a home he had not known he was waiting for.